There's a reason why we still talk about final bosses decades after a game's release. There's not just another enemy or challenge, they're the culmination of everything the game has been teaching us. The level design, the combat mechanics, the story, and even the music all come together for one last test. A great final boss serves as both an exam and a performance. It forces you to use the skills you've honed throughout the game, but it also gives you a moment of spectacle, something memorable that sticks in your mind long after the credits roll. Sometimes the boss is impossibly huge, filling the entire screen. Other times it's personal, a duel against a rival who's been taunting you since the beginning. And occasionally, the most powerful final bosses are the ones who subvert your expectations, not by being massive and terrifying, but by being intimate and even tragic. The way final bosses are designed has changed dramatically over the years, and their evolution tells us a lot about how video games themselves have evolved. From simple pattern-based fights of the 8-bit era to the sprawling cinematic showdowns of today, let's look at the history and evolution of the final boss. The earliest days of gaming were defined by simplicity. Hardware limitations meant developers couldn't create sprawling cutscenes or multi-phase battles. Instead, they relied on patterns. Bosses weren't complex AI-driven enemies, they were puzzles disguised as monsters. Let's start from the beginning. Let's take Bowser in the original Super Mario Bros. He didn't have a complicated moveset or deep mechanics. He walked back and forth, occasionally breathing fire. The challenge came from the level around him, the narrow bridges, the fire bars, and the bottomless pits. Beating Bowser wasn't about brute force, it was about recognizing the pattern and executing with precision. Yet for millions of players, toppling Bowser felt like conquering the ultimate evil. Dr. Wily in the Mega Man series was another 8-bit staple. His fortress wasn't just one fight, it was a series of escalating battles. First came the boss rush, where you had to refight every robot master. Only then did you face Wily himself, usually piloting some elaborate machine with multiple forms. These fights were still rooted in patterns, but they asked players to master the unique weapons they collected throughout the game. And even outside of Nintendo's icons, 8-bit bosses carried the same design ethos. With Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, where it gave us the most intimidating final boss in sports games, Tyson himself, who had devastating one-hit knockdowns if you weren't ready. It was less about learning his patterns and more about enduring the sheer intensity of the fight. These early boss fights weren't flashy, but they set the template. They taught players that the end of a game should feel bigger, harder, and more satisfying than anything that came before. With the jump to 16-bit hardware, bosses became larger, more elaborate, and more cinematic. Developers could use bigger sprites, more detailed animations, and booming soundtracks to make final bosses feel like true climaxes. One of the most memorable examples is Mother Brain from Super Metroid. She begins as a grotesque head in a jar, much like in the original Metroid, but halfway through, the glass shatters and she reveals a towering, monstrous body. Her screen-filling form was shocking in 1994, and the fight itself was relentless, pelting Samus with devastating beams. What really made the battle unforgettable, though, was the scripted moment where Samus is saved by the sacrifice of the baby Metroid, an early example of narrative and gameplay blending seamlessly in a boss fight. Over on the Genesis, Sonic the Hedgehog 2 gave us the Death Egg robot. This towering machine was a stark departure from Sonic's usual bosses. No rings meant one mistake could cost you the entire fight, and the sheer size of the robot made it feel like you were facing impossible odds. For many kids, including myself, defeating the Death Egg was a badge of honor. RPGs in this era raised the bar even higher. Final Fantasy VI's battle against Kefka is legendary. After spending the second half of the game ruling as a god, Kefka is confronted in a multi-tiered showdown, complete with heavenly backdrops and one of Nobuo Uematsu's most iconic themes, Dancing Mad. The fight wasn't just a test of mechanics, it was a narrative climax, the moment when you finally toppled a tyrant who had literally destroyed the world. There were other titles that followed suit. Chrono Trigger's Lavos was not only a tough fight, but a flexible one. Players could encounter him at multiple points in the story, leading to different endings. This was revolutionary for the time, making the final boss feel dynamic rather than fixed. The 16-bit era made it clear. The final boss wasn't just the hardest fight, it had to feel epic, combining gameplay, presentation, and narrative stakes. The jump to 3D in the mid-90s completely redefined what a final boss could be. No longer confined to 2D planes, bosses could now fill entire arenas, chase you across stages, and demand mastery of 3D movement. Super Mario 64 reimagined Bowser in this new space. Instead of hopping over to him to grab an axe, players had to run around an open arena, grab his tail, and swing him into spike bombs. The fight emphasized everything Mario 64 had taught players about 3D platforming: movement, camera control, and spatial awareness. By the final showdown in the sky, Bowser had more attacks, more bombs to hit, and an unforgettable final roar as he is defeated. On the RPG front, Final Fantasy VII delivered one of the most iconic final bosses of all time, Sephiroth. His multi-phase battle, complete with apocalyptic attacks like Supernova, tested everything players had learned over dozens of hours. But what made Sephiroth stand out was the presentation: full-motion video cutscenes, orchestral music, and the sheer weight of his villainy throughout the game. He wasn't just a boss, he was a cultural icon. Shooters also embraced cinematic finales. GoldenEye 007 ended with a tense duel against Trevelyan atop a collapsing satellite dish. It's not the hardest fight in the game, but it was dripping with narrative stakes. The boss wasn't just a faceless enemy, it was your former ally turned rival. And of course, I can't forget about probably the most notable boss of this era, which is Ganondorf and Ganon in The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. First in his castle, then an escape sequence, and finally a showdown against his monstrous form. The fight combined story, atmosphere, and mechanics in a way that made the N64's capabilities shine. This era showed that final bosses could be more than pattern memorization. They could be cinematic, emotional, and deeply tied to the narrative. By the time of the PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube, final bosses had become sprawling, multi-phase battles designed to feel like true climaxes. Games were longer, stories were more ambitious, and players expected payoffs that matched the scope of the journey. Kingdom Hearts set the tone with its showdown against Ansem. The battle escalated through multiple forms. First a duel, then a transformation into monstrous entities, and finally a fight aboard a massive ship-like creature. Each phase introduced new mechanics, keeping players on their toes while driving home Ansem's role as a cosmic threat. In the action genre, Devil May Cry delivered bosses like Mundus that emphasized spectacle as much as difficulty. These fights demanded players not only survive, but do so with style, rewarding mastery of combo systems. RPGs continued to push boundaries. Final Fantasy X had Yu Yevon as its technical final boss, but the true climax was the battle against Jecht, also known as Braska's final Aeon. This fight wasn't just about mechanics, it was an emotional gut punch, forcing protagonist Tidus to confront his own father. And finally, if you know me, I always like to talk about this game when I get the chance, there's Shadow of the Colossus. Its final Colossus wasn't just another fight, it was an endurance test against a towering giant in a stormy ruin. Every step of the climb felt monumental, and by the end, the emotional weight of the game crashed down. The boss wasn't just an obstacle, it was the embodiment of the game's tragic themes. Now we've reached where we are today, where modern final bosses embrace spectacle, narrative, and emotional payoff in equal measure. Technology now allows for seamless blends of cutscenes and gameplay, and developers use this to craft bosses that are as much about storytelling as they are about mechanics. Dark Souls gave us Gwyn, Lord of Cinder. Unlike the towering monsters that came before him, Gwyn was surprisingly human-sized, armed with a flaming sword and relentless aggression. The haunting piano theme emphasized his tragic downfall, the once great lord reduced to a hollow shell. This subversion made Gwyn one of the most memorable final bosses of all time. God of War 2018 showcased another evolution, cinematic duels. The fight against Baldur spanned multiple phases and environments, blending gameplay with quick-time events and cutscenes until the line between movie and game blurred. It's not just about beating a boss, it was about resolving a family saga. Then there are games like The Last of Us Part 2, which redefine the concept of a final boss. Instead of a giant monster or god, the climax is a brutal, intimate fight between Ellie and Abby. The mechanics are simple, but the emotional weight is devastating. It showed that a final boss doesn't need to be the hardest enemy, it just needs to matter. The evolution of final bosses mirrors the evolution of gaming itself. In the 8-bit days, bosses were little more than patterns to memorize. In the 16-bit era, they became bigger and flashier. The 3D leap made them cinematic, while the 6th generation turned them into multi-phase marathons. Today, they can be anything: a screen-filling god, a rival duel, or even a quiet, tragic confrontation. But no matter how they're designed, final bosses remain one of gaming's most enduring traditions. They're the payoff for hours of effort, the moment that defines how we remember a game, and often the encounters that become legend. Hey, thank you so much, as always, for coming and watching these videos. I really appreciate it. Thank you for being here. If you liked the video and you're new here, maybe think about going down, hitting that subscribe button, hit the like button, and ring that notification bell if you want to see more videos like this. Thank you as always, and I'll see you in the next video. I love you. Bye-bye.